Hey, class. In this podcast, I want to talk about the Indian diplomacy of the 1700s. This is a wonderful map. I've also posted this map on Blackboard. It's really, really worth you taking like 2 minutes to look at it. It's got San Juan Bautista, so you can see where San Juan Bautista is, and you can. I'm showing this with my pointer. If you're looking at this on screen, it shows the missions in East Texas that were founded in the 1600s, which failed, and then later in the 1700s. It shows the missions around San Antonio. So it's helpful in that way. It shows the San Saba mission, which I'm going to talk about in later in this podcast. But what I want to talk about today is the various indigenous groups that were in Texas by the 1750s. As I'll talk about in detail, by 1750, the Comanche dominated North and West Texas. The Comanche Empire stretched into New Mexico, what's now New Mexico, what's now Oklahoma, what's now Kansas. It was an enormous empire within North America, which wasn't fully suppressed until after the U.S. Civil War, until about the 1880s. To put it differently, the Comanche Empire wasn't fully suppressed until my grandmother's mother's time. My grandmother's born in 1900, so it's still pretty recent. Now, there's not a lot of evidence about the Comanche Empire in Texas today because the Comanche ultimately were driven into Oklahoma in the 1870s and 1880s. But I'm getting ahead of the story now. And what I want to go back to in this brief podcast is Spanish Texas. So the Comanche come in from the north, from the Santa Fe area. They had gained control, or they had been a fairly weak tribe, and Gwynn talks about this. There's a revolt in Santa Fe in the 1680s. Santa Fe had been settled by the Spanish. The Pueblos kicked the Spanish out for about 20 years in 1680. And the important thing for our purposes is the Pueblos gained control over all the horses that the Spanish had brought into the Santa Fe area. And suddenly, native tribes all over the Southwest, up into Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, um, um, Texas, gain access to the horse because Santa Fe, there were thousands of horses that were captured when the revolt against the Spanish happened in Santa Fe in the 1680. And so suddenly now, in a number of indigenous groups gain access to the horse, which is an incredibly important technology for these folks because it allows them to hunt. It allows them to hunt buffalo much more easily. They don't have to hunt buffalo on foot. They can go long distances to invade their enemies. So the access to the horse just is so profoundly game changing to the Comanche and the Lipan Apache, and this is something that Gwen talks about. So the Comanche were a fairly weak group of indigenous people in southern Wyoming up until around 1680, but then boom, they gain access to the horse after the Santa Fe revolt of 1680. And it just changes for them overnight. They become the most powerful native group in New Mexico, in Texas, in Kansas, during the period up until the 1880s. Now you had other Indian groups that were powerful. The Navajo were very powerful as well. There's a lot of fighting between the Navajo and the Comanche, but for our purposes, let's focus on the Comanche. So the Comanche come into what is now Texas in the early 1700s, and they come in contact with another Indian group, which you'll need to know about in this course, and that's the Lipan Apache. And we call this group of Apache the Lipan Apache because that means Eastern Apache. There were other Apache groups, and these Apache groups were in Arizona, and those were the Mescalero Apache. But the Apache that were in Texas were the Lipan Apache. Okay, and I'll write that down in the outline so you can get a sense of it. So the Comanche and the Lipan Apache become bitter enemies. I just can't say it enough. Um, they did horrifying things to each other. If you were captured by the Comanche, the Lipan Apache, and Gwen talks about this in great detail. But what happens is the Comanche come in and they're much stronger than the Lipan Apache. The Lipan Apache have also gained access to the horse, but the Comanche just turn out to be better fighters. They're just warriors. They're incredible horse warriors. They're kind of like, if you know Russian history, they're kind of like Cossacks, or they're just incredible warriors, and they can do miraculous things with the horse. So what happens is the Comanche come into North Texas from New Mexico. They force the Lipan Apache south. And the Lipan Apache moves south into the area around San Antonio. So it's the Lipan Apache that caused the most headaches for the Spanish in San Antonio in the 1700s. Not that the Comanche didn't cause some headaches, but the Lipan Apache were a bigger headache for the Spanish because the Comanche didn't really see San Antonio as part of its territory. The Comancheria, which I'll talk about in the podcast, ended just north of what's now San Antonio, especially downtown San Antonio. So, in other words, the Comanche come in and they force the Lipan Apache south into the area around San Antonio. The Lipan Apache, in turn, start hassling the small autonomous Indian groups, which we call Colatecan Indians. And they become bitter enemies in turn. So just to repeat, there's a domino effect. The Comanche come in from New Mexico. They push the Lipan Apache south. The Lipan Apache, in turn, start hassling the Indian groups that live south of San Antonio, the indigenous groups that live south of San Antonio. So you've got this you've got this domino effect. And on the map, you can see Comanche, you can see Apache, and then you can see Colatecan. The Comanche, the most powerful, the Lipan Apache, the second most powerful, and the small Colatecan groups, not very powerful at all. Okay, so why is this significant to our story? Because the Colatecan groups, which will come into the San Antonio missions, they come into the San Antonio missions because they need protection from the Spanish. That is their primary motivation for coming into the Spanish missions. They don't really care about Christianity that much, although some do become devout Christians. But why do they come into the missions that the Spanish build? They come into those missions because the Spanish are offering defense from their enemy, the Lipan Apache. And what's these Indian groups, the Colatecan, and the Colatecan were dozens and dozens of small autonomous indigenous groups. Once these groups come into the San Antonio missions, they gain access to the horse, and they become, like any indigenous group that gains access to the horse, they become much more powerful. And so you see during this period, you see these Colatecan groups marching with the Spanish against the Lipan Apache, and at times marching with the Spanish against the Comanche as well. So that's why that's who comes into the missions in San Antonio. The Colatecan Indians that are looking, or the Colatecan indigenous groups that are looking for protection against the Lipan Apache. Now, one of the things that we know about the Colatecan Indian groups now that we didn't have a clear eye on before is, first of all, they had been coming to this area of what's now Texas for hundreds and hundreds of years because there's water here. It's a bit of an oasis, which I've talked about in a previous podcast. There's game here you can hunt. So the area around downtown San Antonio, where the missions are, has been settled, or not settled. Indian groups, indigenous groups. By the way, I do say Indian because Indians is okay to say because a lot of indigenous groups do call themselves Indians. Okay, so I'm not being un-PC here. But so different indigenous groups have been coming to the area around San Antonio for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was a place where people lived more or less in peace because there was enough game. You could hunt here, there was water here. Like I say, it was an oasis. And then suddenly the Spanish appear, which I'm going to talk about. And from the point of view of the indigenous groups, the Spanish are just another, I don't know, they don't really see them as being Spanish versus Comanche versus Apache. They're just another group that showed up in this area, but they have horses and they're able to build missions. And one of the things that we know about the relationship between the Colatecan groups that come into the mission and the Spanish was the Colatecan often didn't really change that much when they went into the missions. For instance, Colatecan men had multiple wives. They never really changed that practice of having a number of wives. The Spanish couldn't change their mind about that. The Colatecan groups often would come and go with the seasons, like they had been doing for hundreds of years. I used to think when I was an undergrad that the Indian groups, the native groups that were in the missions, were basically like slave labor. They were like imprisoned. It really wasn't the case. In many cases, these Colatecan groups came and went as they always had done into this area of what's now Texas. And also the Colatecan groups have a lot of leverage with the Spanish because they're helping the Spanish fight the Lipan Apache and in some cases the Comanche. So we have a much more interesting understanding of the Indian groups, the Colatecans that came into the San Antonio missions than we've ever had before. They have much more of what we call agency. In that the Spanish needed them in many respects almost as much as the Colatecan needed the Spanish, especially when it came to fighting the Lipan Apache. Basically, and just to jump ahead, by about 1800, these Indian groups that had come into the missions, these indigenous groups, many of them had died out. Disease, once again, rears its ugly head. And they largely disappear from the record. Their language disappears. But to this very day, in South San Antonio, on the west side of San Antonio, there are definitely a number of San Antonians who are descendants, who have Colatecan blood running through their veins, who are the product of the intermarriage between the Spanish and the Colatecan groups. So the Colatecan groups died out as autonomous Indian groups, but they certainly live on to this very day in the San Antonio and especially the South Texas area.